There's a quote that shows up on the back cover of at least one biography of Ulysses Grant, repeated so often in documentaries and articles that most people assume it must be settled fact. Robert E. Lee, supposedly, once said he had searched military history, ancient and modern, and never found Grant superior as a general, that he doubted a superior could be found anywhere in all of recorded history. It sounds like the ultimate verdict, the defeated master conceding greatness to the man who beat him. There is a serious problem with that quote. Nobody can actually prove Lee said it. What Lee genuinely thought of Ulysses Grant is a harder, messier question than a single dramatic sentence can answer, and tracking down the real answer means separating what Lee is supposed to have said from what the evidence actually shows he did in front of witnesses when it mattered. A quote with no real foundation. The "never found Grant superior" line traces back to a second-hand account, someone recalling decades later that they had heard Lee say it, recorded in a biography written by James Grant Wilson. There is no direct letter, no diary entry, no first-hand transcript, nothing beyond a second-hand memory published well after the fact. Researchers who have gone looking for a cleaner source have never found one. And there is a second quote circulating right alongside it that makes the whole situation even less trustworthy. This one has Lee writing to one of his sons in 1864, claiming that Grant's entire talent and strategy consisted of accumulating overwhelming numbers, nothing more. Nobody has ever located that letter either, or confirmed which son supposedly received it. Two quotes, both unverifiable, both constantly repeated, and both saying almost the exact opposite of each other. When two contradictory claims about the same man's private opinion are circulating with equal confidence, and neither one has a real paper trail behind it, the honest conclusion is that neither should be trusted as Lee's actual words. The answer Lee actually gave, on the record. If you strip away the disputed quotes and look for what Lee said when someone asked him directly, a much more reliable and much less flattering answer appears. After the war, when Lee was asked who he considered the most capable Union general he had personally faced, he did not hesitate, and he did not say Grant. He said George McClellan. That single, well-documented answer complicates the entire romantic narrative of two evenly matched geniuses locked in mutual admiration. Whatever respect Lee held for Grant, it apparently did not extend to ranking him above a general most historians consider considerably more cautious and considerably less effective. The line Lee drew in his own classroom. Where the record does become genuinely solid is in what Lee was willing to do, not just say, on Grant's behalf. After the war, serving as president of Washington College, Lee was approached by a man who spoke disrespectfully about Grant in his presence. Lee's response left no room for interpretation. He told the man plainly that if he ever again presumed to speak that way about General Grant in front of him, one of the two of them would be severing their connection with the university. This is not the reaction of a man who privately despised his old adversary. Whatever tactical criticisms Lee may have harbored, he was not willing to let Grant's character be attacked on his own campus, by his own students, while he stood there and said nothing. What Lee's own secretary witnessed at Appomattox. One of the clearest, most credible windows into Lee's private reaction comes not from Lee himself, but from Colonel Charles Marshall, his military secretary, who stood in the room at the McLean House and remained loyal to Lee's memory for the rest of his own life. Marshall later delivered a eulogy at Grant's funeral, describing him as knightly and noble, and stated clearly that Lee felt the same way. Marshall pointed specifically to the language Grant used in the surrender terms, carefully written to avoid humiliating the defeated Confederate Army, framing the war's casualties as belonging to Americans rather than assigning blame to North or South. According to Marshall, that specific choice of language visibly moved Lee, with real emotion, in a moment that had every reason to be the most bitter of his military life instead. What Lee understood, even if he never said it in a quotable line. The most reliable evidence of what Lee actually thought of Grant may not be a quote at all. It is Lee's own strategic behavior during the brutal months of the 1864 Overland Campaign. Lee won tactical engagements throughout that spring, at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, and none of it mattered in the way tactical victories were supposed to matter against every Union commander who had come before Grant. After each battle, Grant simply moved his army left, kept pressing toward Richmond, and refused to retreat the way McClellan or Hooker or Burnside had retreated after their own setbacks. Lee had no effective answer to that pattern, and by his own private assessment to those around him, he understood exactly what it meant. He knew Grant had him outnumbered. He knew Grant had resources the Confederacy could not match. He predicted correctly that if the campaign around Richmond and Petersburg ever settled into a siege, that would mark the beginning of the end. None of that required Lee to say Grant was a genius out loud. It only required him to recognize, in the dwindling of his own options, that he was finally facing a Union commander who would not be shaken loose. The case his own officers made, that Lee never joined. It is worth noticing what Lee did not do after the war, because so many of the men who had served under him did it constantly and enthusiastically. Jubal Early built much of his post-war reputation attacking Grant directly, at one point comparing Lee to the Great Pyramid and Grant to what he called a pygmy perched on Mount Atlas. Other former Confederate officers spent years insisting Grant had won only through brute force and indifference to his own soldiers' lives, feeding a version of the war's history that would come to be known as the Lost Cause. Lee never joined that chorus. He did not write memoirs attacking Grant's character, did not give speeches diminishing his generalship, and as his response to the disrespectful visitor at Washington College shows, actively shut the argument down when it was made in front of him. His silence, set against how loud his own subordinates were willing to be, says something on its own. A number Lee had every reason to know. There is one more piece of evidence worth including, not because Lee ever stated it directly, but because it undercuts the old narrative so thoroughly that it changes how his private thinking should probably be read. A close look at the war's actual casualty figures shows that Lee's own aggressive strategy in 1862 and 1863, the strategy that built his reputation as a battlefield master, cost his single army 209,000 casualties, 55,000 more than all four of the armies Grant commanded across 3 separate theaters combined, every one of which ended in Union victory. If Lee was honest with himself about that arithmetic, and there is little reason to think a man of his intelligence was not, then whatever private opinion he held of Grant's methods, he also had good reason to know his own aggressive tactics had cost the Confederacy more than Grant's supposedly crude, brute force approach had cost the Union. What the honest answer actually looks like. So what did Robert E. Lee truly think of Ulysses Grant? Not the version people want, a single perfect sentence conceding total genius to his conqueror, because that sentence probably never existed. What the evidence actually supports is something quieter and more specific. Lee ranked McClellan above him when asked directly, refused to let his own students disrespect Grant's name in his presence, and was visibly moved by the decency Grant showed him at the exact moment their war ended. He understood, in the collapse of his own options across the spring of 1864, that he had finally met a Union commander who would not be talked out of finishing what he started. And he never once joined the growing chorus of his own former officers working to tear that opponent down after the fact. That is not the story of a man who thought Grant was a genius beyond compare. It is the story of a man who respected an opponent enough to stay quiet, defend his character, and let the record speak for itself, even when so many people around him were determined to write a different version.